Families in China should have the right to give birth to as many children as they would like because the one-child policy is causing major demographic issues, the policy is enforced in dangerous ways, and adoptions and orphanages are no longer an ideal place for Chinese children to be raised. The one-child policy was instituted in 1979 by Deng Xiaoping and affects over 35% of the Chinese population. The one-child policy eliminates families' rights to have as many children as they want and requires families to have only one child in urban areas. Families in rural areas are commonly allowed to have more than one child if the first is a girl, so a male can stay and work on the farm where a girl would have to marry. Ethnic minorities in China are also not required to abide by the family planning policy, as the law is formally entitled. The one-child policy is restricted to Han Chinese in urban environments. The family planning policy was designated as a temporary measure to reduce the population in China and to reduce poverty and hunger. The world's population is 6.7 billion people, and China represents 20% of that population. 1 in every 5 people in the world is a resident of China. In the 1950s, there was a concern about growth in population, and there was a birth control program introduced. Chairman Mao then began the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's plan in 1958 to focus on making China's economy modern by 1988. This is when Chairman Mao reversed the policy, believing that a large population would make China's military power stronger. China reached the largest population in the world with 540 million people. The one-child policy isn't as simple as every parent having one child. Just like any other law, people refuse to abide by the one-child policy. When parents have multiple children, there are many consequences. The consequences can be fines that are 3 times the family income, lost benefits from the state, and sterilization. Since 1971, Chinese doctors have aborted 336 million babies, undertaken 196 million sterilizations, and 403 million intrauterine devices have been inserted into women, often without consent from the woman. About 7 million babies are aborted in a year in China due to the families not receiving the right to have multiple children. Mao Hangfeng was a 7-month pregnant woman living in China. When government officials found out she was pregnant, they barged into her house and dragged her out into a car and took her to the hospital where the baby was aborted. The dead baby was then laid by her side as a consequence, hoping it would cause her to not get pregnant again. This is not the only case of government officials forcefully aborting women. Yu Rongfan is also a citizen in China who was forced to have an abortion. She stated, "I was screaming. I wouldn't let them do it, but it was no use. There were so many of them holding me down." Yu also stated, "To kill a kid, a healthy living baby, is murder. He grew up in my tummy slowly. He was my very own child. I think about it very often, all the time." Commonly in China, the government will say the family agreed to have an abortion or not allow the case to reach media. In our 4 interviews with Chinese citizens, 3 men stated that the law was not being enforced in dangerous ways at all. This shows just how little is known by Chinese citizens of their one-child policy. According to Lajia Research Foundation, forced late-term abortions cause major health risks, especially performed under poor sanitary situations. Overseas adoption first began in 1993. There are more children adopted from China than any other country in the world. Overseas adoption fastly grew.
I was born in China and I was brought here.
My real biological mother left me in a basket with me and my sisters.
Sometimes my parents say that I was meant for them. And sometimes I really do think that.
If it wasn't for my mom and dad, I bet I'd still be in the orphan.
In 1995, 2,500 children were sent into foreign adoption. 3 years later, in 1998, the number nearly doubled with 4,855 children sent into foreign adoption. By 2005, 14,855 Chinese babies were sent into foreign adoption. At the end of 2010, there were more than 120,000 Chinese orphans adopted, the majority of which were Chinese girls. Of the 1.5 million children adopted in the United States, 8,000 come from China. In 1999, there were a total of 4,108 adoptions in China. 4,020 of them were females. The girls that are given to different countries cause the gender imbalance in China to get worse. Unfortunately, over 100,000 baby girls are abandoned every year because parents lack the right to have as many children as they wish. The abandoned baby girls then become the government's responsibility in orphanages. In 1979, when the one-child policy was implemented, orphanages began to get very crowded and the amount of orphans was only increasing drastically. In the 1960s and 70s, orphanages didn't have as much trouble finding homes for healthy and disabled children because families were large with an average of 6 children per family. In the 1980s, when the amount of orphans was rocketing and when the one-child policy was implemented, it was harder for orphanages to find homes for children. Nobody wanted girls. Statistics from the Chinese government published in early 1990s stated more than half of the children who arrived in orphanages died within the first few months. Orphanages are not an ideal place for children to be raised, even though the conditions have gotten better with the government funding. According to Ava Rose, an orphan from China, the orphanages are small and babies are often sharing cribs. There are not enough caregivers for the babies. Sometimes babies didn't get fed enough to meet their daily calorie intake. Being abandoned and adopted as children can have some significant effects on children as they grow older. Ava Rose, Samantha, Laxon, Rachel, and Zia are all orphans born in China and adopted by American parents. These girls all went to visit China together and meet their caregivers from before they were adopted. Ava stated, "Our visits stirred up all kinds of memories and emotions, excitement, sadness, and even anger. These girls all attend counseling group together to talk about how they are all doing after visiting their home country." With the one-child policy, it is not uncommon for children to be adopted overseas and even stuck in orphanages for years until they reach adulthood waiting to be adopted. This is causing emotional consequences to the lost children of China. These children are sent into orphanages due to parents looking for the perfect birth since they are neglected their right to have as many children as they wish. Since 1979, when the one-child policy was implemented in China, demographic issues have been getting more severe. China is beginning to face demographic issues such as gender imbalance and the ratio of young kids to elderly. China's gender imbalance has reached 199 males to every 100 females born, which is 20% higher than average for industrialized countries. The gender imbalance has been caused by families abandoning girls because they lack the right to have multiple children. After these children are abandoned, they are often adopted overseas, making the gender imbalance even more significant. There are around 30 million more boys than girls currently in China. By 2020, it is expected that there will be 40 million married men without a wife to marry in China. The schools in China are filled with a majority of boys. The average school in China has 39 kids per class, 28 of which are boys. In 2000, there are nearly 19 million more boys than girls. There are 1.7 million girls missing each year in China. A sign that ought to be posted on telephone poles across Beijing, but which one will never read, "Missing millions and millions of Chinese women." These women aren't missing because they are kidnapped. They are being killed, abandoned, and sent overseas to different countries. A Chinese economist stated, "This makes Chinese population look more like a developed country than a developing country, which is a key disadvantage to labor-intensive industries. China's gender ratio is unbalanced as a result. The trouble is that the men which the custom of selectively sought to produce will have to pay for their privilege by suffering a shortage of brides. More and more Chinese parents only have one child and they want that child to be a boy. In fact, there is pressure for families to make sure the child is male. Selective abortion and female infanticide is common throughout China. The families do not value having girls. Anti-discrimination laws and rules on equality and female rights will have to be strengthened to ensure that Chinese families do have more females. Women are not even permitted to find out the sex of their unborn babies in an effort to encourage mothers to not discriminate between having a boy or a girl. Families in China deserve the right to give birth to as many children as they wish. This is a natural human right. The one-child policy is causing major demographic issues to the country. Orphanages in China are no longer an ideal place for children to be raised due to overcrowding, and the family planning policy is being enforced in dangerous ways. The Chinese government began the one-child policy in hopes to control their population. However, years later, China is dealing with the horrible consequences to this policy, forcing families to place their rights on hold to abide by a broken law.